Okay, hopefully everyone can see that there. So yeah, I like this title here. Our nature is what we make of it, and that's exactly what it was. We had a partnership with the Salt Lake Public Lands Division in updating and look while before they begin to update their master plan. We had this moment to engage with the community to reimagine nature, to see what we can do to better improve public lands within Salt Lake for the future, the next 20, 30 years. And so here on the right, yeah, this is the many students who worked on the project, and many of them you'll hear from today. Including myself here today. I'm going to be talking a little bit about the intercept interviews and online engagement. So this was the portion that where we really were able to dive in and participate with the community and just going around and talking to people, and also engaging in online posts through social media. And yeah, no, we're gonna have Maddie explain that process a little bit more.
Thanks, Kendall. My name is Maddie McDonough, and I'll be sharing some more of our anecdotal experiences and general findings with the process. During this first round of community engagement for the Public Lands Master Plan, my classmates and I focused on 3 key forms of public participation. One were intercept interviews on site at parks, trails, pop-up events, and outside businesses such as grocery stores. 2 were reaching out to community groups and businesses online and through social media. And then 3, running focus groups that were targeted at reaching residents from Salt Lake's west side. As a note, this is only the first round of community engagement for the Salt Lake City Public Lands Master Plan, so further opportunities will arise throughout the process.
Okay, so a bit about the scope of our project. So to begin, we have our public intercept locations. This is where we went out and we intercepted people and talked to people and got their feedback through surveys. We were able to get around to about over 20 different parks, 10 natural areas, and 20 other different areas such as grocery stores or just within the community, walking through downtown. And with organizations, we actually went about and advertised both our online survey and in-paper survey at over 200 establishments and organizations throughout Salt Lake City and throughout just the greater Salt Lake. And online engagement, this was more so also advertising our online survey. And as students, we were able to make over 200 different posts in advertising that, and we received great feedback, almost 300 comments and over 60 shares from other people. And in total, from both the online and in-person surveys, we were able to collect over 4,000 surveys from all over the community, which provided us with some very great feedback. So I'm just going to go over some of the just briefly snapshot areas that we were able to reach. This is our intercept interview locations. So this was some of our different parks, some of our different natural areas and other areas. And most of these were within the Salt Lake City. There were also a few other in Mill Creek. And we even had one student on the public transportation going around and getting feedback or in some surveys. So it represents a good diversity within Salt Lake, both on the west side and also on the east side, and in many of our parks and along many of our trails. And this is just with different organizations. This one reaches out more to the greater Salt Lake area, different regional centers that have influence within with people who visit parks and natural areas in Salt Lake. And so we, as the picture's showing, we put out posters, gave out postcards, and there's a great concentration here within Salt Lake also. And yeah, we just had many different grocery stores, different organizations, and you name it. We're working with people in the biking community or hiking, and it was really great. And that I believe really brought really gave us good advertisement for the online survey, and we were able to bring so many people from different backgrounds to answer that.
Yeah, as Kendall was describing, we had to be kind of creative with this process, given the unusual circumstances under which this community engagement was taking place. But we were able to have some truly excellent conversations with people who are very invested in the future of our public lands. I'm going to share a snapshot of our findings throughout the process, and then each of these topics will be elaborated on during the remainder of our presentation. So first, as Kendall mentioned, social media was used extensively to reach groups and individuals who may have an interest in this process. The responsiveness of businesses and organizations contacted online and through social media varied pretty significantly. In-person closures certainly limited the number of places willing to display signs or advertise the community engagement process. We found that online engagement was highest when a message asking to share information with followers was accompanied by a picture and a post that was ready to go. In general, we found that older adults were more responsive to completing in-person interviews than were younger adults. And having an online option accessible through a flyer or a postcard was really helpful for those who either didn't feel comfortable answering questions in person or didn't have the time. Events like pop-up events that involved food were particularly successful in drawing crowds. And one effective strategy that we identified was giving food vouchers after the completion of a survey. And finally, I'll touch on some experiences from intercept interviews. Those intercept interviews involve approaching people in person to ask them questions from the survey. So literally intercepting a sample of the population in public places. As a class, we completed 619 intercept interviews. These interviews proved to be challenging for a variety of reasons. Some of us had previous experience in engaging with strangers and others of us did not. But regardless of previous experience, there was certainly a learning curve when it came to navigating COVID-19. We experienced a general uneasiness to speak in person and definitely varying degrees of comfort in terms of things like social distancing. There were a few reported incidents of difficulty communicating with the public related to mask wearing, either the interviewer or interviewee having challenges being understood. And some of the variations of intercept interviewing, such as passing the questions and a pen to a member of the public to complete demographic information, was limited due to necessary precautions. But given the number and variety of survey responses, it does not appear that COVID-19 alone deterred participation in this community engagement process. And in fact, it may have emphasized the importance of our nearby natural spaces. Now we are going to hear some more specific data about both the in-person intercept interviews and the survey available online.
Hey guys, I'm going to take it from here. I worked with my team who are going to be presenting today, which includes Joseph and Brad. And we dived into the data and created a few maps to go along with it that looked into the answers to these intercept and main survey interviews we had. So we can dive right into there with the next slide, please. So in comparing the two surveys, like we said, we had intercept survey had 609 total participants and main survey had 3,717. They both took about 10 to 15 minutes to complete. The intercept survey, of course, we did online and on paper. The online section was kind of in a response to COVID-19 and trying to make it more accessible to people who might have concerns with germs and just doing anything in person. And the main survey was only online. Next slide, please. So in comparing the two response groups we got, the intercept survey, we had a slight majority female with 53%. In comparison, the main survey had a slight majority male with, again, 53%. We would expect it to be around 50-50. And so there's just slight variations between who we actually reached out to with each survey. Next slide, please. We asked the respondents their age, and overwhelmingly, the intercept survey had a bit of a younger audience. In fact, 75% were under the age of 40 within the intercept survey responses, where the main survey had 50% under the age of 40. So you just kind of reach out to different people depending on the medium you choose, which was an interesting finding. Next slide. We looked at race or ethnicity. Intercept survey had a bit more diverse representation of minority groups. There were 71% of respondents were white, but we did see a bigger chunk of the population represented with minority groups versus the main survey, which was increasingly more white dominant. Next slide, please. We asked them their income. The intercept survey had a bit of a less wealthy audience. So we were able to hear from lower income brackets. About 19% of the intercept survey respondents had over $100,000 in annual income. And then 23% were actually under 25,000 versus the main, where 45% had earned over $100,000 a year and under 7% earned under 25,000. So it's just the intercept survey seemed to put us in touch with some less wealthy residents. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, just to sum the two up, intercept survey, of course, slight majority female, younger respondents, more minority representation, and it's skewed toward lower income brackets. And the main, just kind of all the opposites. So it kind of, with the two together, it gave us a good representation of our community to a good extent. We're gonna go with Brad for the next couple slides, looking at the data spatially.
Great, thank you, Luke. So we made a map, two different maps here, where this one particular, the intercept surveys are overlaid on top of the population density for Salt Lake City. And it's also broken up as far as the different master plan communities. So this gives us a good understanding of the distribution of not only the population within Salt Lake, but also the distribution of the number of surveys that we collected within the certain and respective communities. With this and the next map, not all of the data, not all of each survey received is inputted in here. There is some missing data as far as some people didn't fill out what sort of community they're from or what zip code to be able to tie something geospatially. But for the most part, there is a pretty good distribution of surveys collected in person down in the Sugar House community and along the west side of Salt Lake. This could be due to the strong effort that the course made to do intercept surveys, pop-up events along the western side and focus groups to kind of get a better understanding of that region and communities of Salt Lake. Next slide, please. So again, it's the same population distribution. This is off of the tracks from the 2019 or 2015 US Census. So here we have the main surveys. Again, this is where we collected just over 3,000 online. And so the distribution here, you can kind of see that we do, that we weren't able to collect as many surveys within the west communities, west side communities of Salt Lake. And so it was really good to kind of take this information and see where we can improve on the location of where we're able to kind of focus and collect surveys and the different demographics and spread of people of what we're trying to get an input from. Next slide. I think this is back to Luke.
Looking at the intercept interview data, we can subdivide the questions into three main categories: use, current feelings, and future vision of public spaces. Using this data, we were able to gain a better picture on how people interacted with Salt Lake City's parks, trails, and public spaces. Going into the use category, we asked respondents how important these spaces were to them. As you can see from the pie chart, the community finds these spaces extremely important. Next slide. We then wanted to understand how people access these spaces. From the responses, we can see that the majority of users access these spaces by car. However, a significant portion also access these spaces through active modes of transportation, such as walking or biking, indicating that these individuals may access these spaces close to where they live or work. Next slide. We were then interested in understanding respondents' use levels of parks and trails throughout this last year. As we can see from the donut chart, with the interior loop representing park use and the exterior loop representing trail use, the majority of respondents are either using these spaces at a rate that is equal or greater to those in previous years. Next slide. Moving forward, we looked at which public spaces respondents believed were accessible by either walking or biking from their homes. In order to understand this data better, we analyzed not just from our aggregate totals, but also by demographic category. The aggregate total data shows that parks are the most accessible public space for people. However, recreation trails, natural areas, and public spaces with abundant trees are also highly accessible. Next slide. When we started to analyze by demographic group, we came across two interesting findings. The first what was noticed in the race ethnicity demographics, where Hispanic or Latinos indicated that they felt that their accessibility to recreation trails, natural areas, public spaces with abundant trees, and golf courses were generally less than other groups had indicated. The second finding was noticed in the income demographics, which is visualized in the bottom table, where those making more than $150,000 a year felt that they had greater access to these spaces than other groups had indicated. Next slide. We then wanted to understand what prevented respondents from accessing these spaces. As the graph shows, the majority of respondents chose not applicable. As this question was multiple choice, this could indicate that they didn't find a response that represented how they felt, or it could indicate that they didn't feel like there was anything preventing them from actually accessing these spaces. Looking at the next two preferred responses, people were prevented because these spaces were too crowded and because there were safety or security concerns. Next slide. While the previous question indicated that only 77 respondents were prevented from spending time in these spaces due to safety concerns, In this question, we can see that 55% of respondents had avoided, not enjoyed, or felt uncomfortable in these spaces. Next slide. Breaking this question into demographic groups, we can see that females and those over the age of 22 had more of a tendency to avoid, not enjoy, or feel uncomfortable in city parks or natural areas. Next slide. When we asked respondents to elaborate, they indicated that Pioneer Park, Liberty Park, and the Jordan River Parkway Trail were locations that people generally avoided, didn't enjoy, or felt uncomfortable in, while homelessness, poor night safety infrastructure, and drug use were main reasons for people's uneasiness in these spaces. Next slide. Finishing up with the future vision of these spaces, we wanted to know which two system-wide approaches would most benefit the livability of Salt Lake City. Respondents felt that investing in neighborhood public lands and amenities that encouraged everyday use and improving sidewalks, trails, and trail networks for travel or bike would be the most beneficial. Next slide. Finally, our last intercept interview question showed what ideas were most prevalent when looking at what should happen with public spaces in the future. Many of these words are repeated between the two questions, but I think that they do a pretty good job of highlighting some of the main ideas. The first one was the word more. This may be somewhat difficult to implement, as it often was used as an adjective describing the quality and size of public spaces, as well as an indicator of a need for amenities such as restrooms, trash receptacles, or trees, etc. Some other ideas that are highlighted in the responses were cleanliness, safety, sustainability, and community. Next slide.
I'm going to close this out with a couple questions and responses from the main survey. With this question, we asked what of these areas are easy to access from your home. The biggest responses of the 3,700 respondents, we had 3,100 saying city parks. And then the next couple options were trails, bike paths, etc., as you can see here. Next slide. We also asked, similar to the intercept interview, how has your frequency of parks and trails changed this year compared to previous years? Again, we saw more or the same frequency of accessing parks. Next slide. And lastly, we asked, what are some big ideas and potential locations for projects and programs? Where a majority of the responses focused on either trail network or neighborhood and miniature parks, which implies that they want closer parks to their homes or better accessibility and connection to these parks. Interestingly, over 40% of respondents said they wanted focus on the trail system, either through the Emerald Ribbon or Mountains to Lake Trail connection. Next group we'll hear from is the focus group team, which will be led by Hannah.
Thanks, Luke. So after we did the intercept interviews and the main survey, we held focus groups in an attempt to try to get some of the populations who may have been missed throughout that process. Next slide. During the focus groups, we met with 6 total groups and had 54 participants. We did have a script that ran about an hour and a half that helped guide our questions and give us a good sense of how these people are feeling about how they're satisfied or dissatisfied with the parks. And also we hit themes of stewardship and equity. We also had really great help from several community coalitions to try to find or try to engage more people from Salt Lake City's west side. Next slide. So these are the students who led the focus groups. We did hold 2 focus groups in person, and those were held at Palmer Court, which is managed by Road Home. And we also held a focus group that was done entirely in Spanish by our wonderful interpreters today. And so doing this really helped us reach some of the some groups that are typically underrepresented in community engagement practices, including those who have lived experience with homelessness. And Molly is now going to discuss some more of the demographic factors.
Thank you. So I'll be giving a brief overview of the demographics of the focus group. Again, there were 54 participants throughout the 6 focus groups. Here we can see that 2/3 of the participants lived in these first 4 communities: Glendale, Central City, Poplar Grove, and Rose Park. So a lot of representation from the West Side and downtown communities. Next slide. For age, almost half of the focus group participants were between the ages of 31 and 50, with about a quarter being younger than 31 and a quarter older than 50. So pretty well distributed age grouping. Next slide, please. We asked about race and ethnicity. A large majority identified as either Hispanic or Latino or white. We also had representation by Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islanders, Black or African Americans, and other ethnic groups as well. Next slide, please. For household income, almost half of the participants have a household income of under $25,000. And the other half are pretty well distributed among the other income groups. Okay, next slide. And I'll quickly just mention about 2/3 of our focus group participants were female. Great, I'll hand it back over to Hannah.
Thank you. So these are some of the themes that came up in the focus groups. A lot of participants raised the issue of cleanliness and levels of maintenance in the parks. They wanted to see more trash cans and more regular cleaning in these areas. But some people took it as personal responsibility and wanted to see more engagement in stewardship opportunities to get the community involved in cleaning up these spaces. Next slide. Participants also brought up safety concerns. They particularly felt unsafe on the Jordan River Trail. And residents really brought up the issue of lighting as well, and needing more of that in the parks. Next slide. And participants also really wanted to see their signs put in languages which they speak throughout the parks. We really found that speaking to people in their language is critical to making them feel included in the process. Residents also wanted to see the diverse cultures of Salt Lake City represented in the parks. This can include renaming the parks and trails to adding information about Indigenous cultures, as well as the culture of the neighborhood that the parks are in. Next slide.
We also discussed with the focus groups stewardship programs or stewardship generally, and some residents pointed to youth as potential stewards of our public lands. I'd like to read this quote from a participant. "I feel like if we were to focus these programs of cleanup more towards youth, then there'd be more people involved in cleaning up these neighborhoods because, you know, youth have a lot of energy." Ranger programs were also mentioned as potential stewards, or an eye out along the Jordan River Parkway, and were brought up in several of the focus groups. Next slide, please. Activated spaces also were brought up among a lot of the focus groups. Participants mentioned that different types of amenities than what currently exists could help improve the spaces and make them more appealing to residents. One example is using the tennis courts and renovating it to something more people use, i.e. pickleball. Programming was also mentioned by residents in Westside parks and public lands. This could be festivals, farmers markets, any kind of active programming. One quote says, "Look at our community in Glendale. We have a huge Latinx, Pacific Islander, refugee. I mean, we have this really, really rich population, but none of the festivals are held in our areas." Next slide, please. Accessibility was another theme that was touched on in focus groups. Some residents found that site features were inaccessible for wheelchairs. There need to be more rest areas. And accessibility in terms of getting to public lands was also a struggle for some in terms of bicycle paths and trails. Next slide, please. Finally, a theme of engagement within the focus group emerged, talking about how to engage residents. I would like to share this quote from a focus group participant. "I would like for voices like ours to be part of the process all the way up to the very end. A lot of times it's just the initial stages of data gathering, and then like someone else will draft it and present it, and then there's no follow-up with a community. So I think it's representation and trying to avoid the recolonization of our communities and taking knowledge from us without that knowledge coming back to us in some way." So for focus groups, we're going to actually turn over to discuss some recommendations.
Thanks, Molly. My name is Andrews Hart, and I'll be going over some of the recommendations that we have just based on all of this information that's been presented so far, as well as some recommendations from some in-class exercises that we as the students did over this semester. Next slide, please. So looking at the intercept interviews for public lands, there were some common themes that emerged, and some of these had to do with investment in neighborhood parks and connectivity. When we asked what 3 words would sum up the big 10-year goals for public lands, the words that came from the survey were clean, accessible, and sustainability. And the top 3 words from the main survey were protect, grow, and connect. So from these answers, some system-wide approaches that may need to be prioritized are investing in neighborhood parks and improving the sidewalks and trails to improve connectivity. So when asked which potential big ideas or possible locations for projects, the 3 most supported projects included building a Salt Lake City Emerald Ribbon, creating trails from the mountains to the lake, and 3rd, reimagining Salt Lake City mini and neighborhood parks. So these just highlight the importance of having a really connected parks and public land system in all parts of the city that allows people to travel through that system, as well as having cultural representation. Next slide, please. So students also gave feedback on the surveys and engagement efforts. Just from our experience doing these surveys and talking to people. One of the most common themes from this was that the survey could have been a little shorter. It would have made it easier to complete the survey and just to respect people's time. The survey should avoid jargon and technical terms that people may not understand or be familiar with. Additionally, it might be helpful to test surveys through focus groups to make sure that they flow well and people can understand them. Promotional materials like posters and surveys should all be translated into prominent languages spoken in Salt Lake City to reflect the diversity that we have and to reach groups who may not normally participate in outreach activities. Questions like how important are parks to you, or do you like parks, should be asked with a Likert scale of 1 to 5, where people can rank numerically their answers. This facilitates better data analysis in post-processing. And demographic and income questions can be a little uncomfortable, so we suggest that these could be optional in the survey, either in person or online. During COVID-19, it is a bit of a safety concern to be doing surveys in person. So I think we thought that emphasizing online engagement is really important during this time. One way to do that would be to include a chance to earn a gift card or to win a gift card for participating, and possibly having fewer open-ended questions just to facilitate a better flow in the surveys. The URL used for the online surveys could be changed to make it seem a little more legitimate, so people aren't worried about getting a virus on their phone or computer. And also, we want the city residents to feel empowered and to see that their input is reflected in every stage of this process and not just in the first stage. And so they can have an impact on parks and public lands. Next slide, please. Additionally, students gave some feedback on equity and ways that engagement and parks in general can provide that equity. Some of these include improving walkability and bikeability throughout the system so people can get to these parks between them, especially for people who don't have access to cars. Additionally, adding green space to the west side would improve equity, as would possibly incorporating permaculture and urban farming, just as a way to engage people more and activate people in public spaces so that they don't, there's just more options for them in parks. As we mentioned in the focus group section, cultural festivals and food events can be a big draw to parks and bring people together and highlight the diversity that we have in Salt Lake City. Building on existing ranger programs would be a step forward as well, especially when it comes to interacting with people who are experiencing homelessness as a way to reduce tensions and provide services and support to people who need it. And additionally, something we are looking at is developing an equity mapping tool to see where equity can be improved geographically throughout the city and to provide better services to the city's residents.
All right, thank you, Anders. Additionally, students had some feedback on the format of our focus groups that we conducted. Although overall the group that participated, or the group of people that participated in the focus groups, was diverse and helped us to better represent the West Side and those experiencing homelessness in our community, each focus group itself was reasonably homogeneous and could be helpful to mix these groups so that people serving on the same councils or living within the same neighborhoods don't create a silo in conversation or topics discussed in the focus groups. The sample size of focus groups is quite small by design, so it may be helpful in the future to increase the number of individual focus groups to increase the sample size as well. Some other things to note include that the Public Lands Division was actually involved in the focus groups, which was a great way for participants to ask direct questions, start conversations with people who are actually working in that department. It's not a super traditional method, however. It could be an interesting experience to see what types of communication or discussions are happening if people are unaware of the Public Lands Division participation in the focus groups in the future. It obviously was also in the time of COVID, so we used a different format via Zoom calls for several of our focus groups and in person for 2 of them. And the Zoom format obviously has some hiccups here and there. So this is something to consider in the future as well. But yeah, thank you. And we'll go to the next slide. Through some of our outreach strategies, youth were not as represented as other groups. One suggestion for future collection of input is to include a youth advisory committee. This committee of youth could deploy other outreach strategies. In particular, high schoolers or middle schoolers can use social media platforms to encourage other people in their age group to continue or to contribute their opinion and get others to do the same. Great efforts were given to reach people of color in Salt Lake City through intercept surveys, outreach events, and focus groups. Efforts like this should definitely be replicated going forward to ensure representation. Could be helpful in the future to emphasize community and organizational outreach and to use pop-up events strategically to encourage unsheltered community members to participate as well. Additionally, targeted mail-in surveys could help to reach communities that are lacking in computer literacy or access to internet. With targeted surveys and potentially creative logistics, this could potentially broaden the scope of input collected. Next slide, please. During interviews and focus groups, many community members had concerns about facilities and garbage cans, for example. It would be helpful to have a way to quantify the needs at each park in order to address those needs more specifically. In addition to tracking care of facilities, it could be possible to evaluate the condition of care of plants, of the lawns, of the amenities that are in the parks. And this could help to really hone in the efforts of the Parks Department, the Public Lands Department and their funding. It could include means of public input as well, things like using apps so that people who are actually in the parks in real time could contribute their opinions or their thoughts about the care of the park, or if there are specific needs at that time. And there are other ways as well of trying to collect community input. Some of these could be using online forums from media publications and things of that nature to collect information from people who aren't actively being sought out by the Public Lands Division or by our group as well. Next slide. This concludes our presentation. As Dr. Garcia let us know at the beginning, there is a report forthcoming, and we're still excited to continue to take input from our audience and our community. Thank you so much for joining today, and we can open it up to questions now.